back to part 2 of this lecture, this second lecture on mass victimisation, looking at genocide in Rwanda, genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So we just mentioned at the end of part 1 that in part 2 we're going to be talking about survivors and what survivors want from justice. And I've been really fortunate that I've been able to sit and listen to survivors on numerous occasions. A whole range of different survivors, both those that survived and remained in Rwanda for the duration of the genocide and its aftermath, and also survivors who fled the country and returned shortly after the genocide finished, and also those that fled the country and then returned to Rwanda much later. So I've been really lucky to listen to both young and old survivors and meet survivors' communities. And really try to get an understanding of what their needs are, what they would like to happen, things that they think have worked, things that they think haven't worked particularly well. And as well as physically meeting a lot of these survivors, I've collected and amassed quite a large number of both books and other sources that give verbatim testimony of victims, where victims have been asked these sorts of questions about what do you want from justice, what do you think about justice, is it happening, these sorts of issues, to the point that I think I've got a relatively good understanding of the situation, not across the board, because different victims, different survivors have got different needs, have got different wants. You've got some that do still harbour anger and resentment. You've got some that would still want heavy punishment of perpetrators. You've got others that believe genuinely that, although they might have initially started off feeling that way, that they're at a situation now, in a position now, where they understand the country, for the good of the country, for the good of even their own mental health, there needs to be some sort of closure. And that there, in some cases, is genuine forgiveness as well. In some cases, as difficult as it might be for you to believe, even survivors who lost family members have been able to genuinely forgive the people that perpetrated that violence against them and their families. And there's a number of videos that I will upload to the My UWS site, which have explicit examples of what you would call reconciliation between victims and perpetrators. And in some cases, we're simply talking about on the whole. So in some cases, we're talking about survivors in general forgiving or accepting that they need to move on related to perpetrators as a whole. But in other cases, the specific examples that we can give and can show you relate specifically to the actual perpetrator that caused the victim or the survivor's family serious harm. So in some cases, you will have a survivor whose, let's say, children were killed. And the actual killer, perpetrator of killing those children, has now, let's say, moved back to that community. And not necessarily immediately, but over a passage of time, that survivor has genuinely forgiven and reconciled with that perpetrator. Now, that might be incredibly hard for you to understand or even believe. And I think that you have to really probably listen an awful lot to what survivors tell you, and to actually see and really think about the issues involved, to begin to get your head around that. It's not something that you can very easily and very quickly understand. But when you understand the whole context of Rwanda, you do begin to understand a little bit about how that sort of forgiveness and reconciliation might come to happen. So I do have a few little examples of just excerpts of certain survivors' testimonies, certain victims' testimonies that we can talk about here. And what I would say is really interesting is that if you look at testimonies of victims or survivors in the initial 10 years in the aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi, so up until 2004, 2005, if you look at a lot of those testimonies, you can actually sense quite a lot of anger and hurt, deep hurt in those testimonies, understandably. And there is a bit more of a tone whereby, not all again, but a number of victims and survivors are calling for things like heavy punishments. But what is quite interesting is that if you then look at some of the later on testimonies that have been taken, so if you fast forward to, let's say, the last 5 years, and if you look at testimonies of victims and survivors now, the tone in general across the board that comes from those testimonies is markedly different. You see a lot more themes which do relate more to, rather than the need for retribution and the need for punishment, a lot more about the need for reconciliation and the realities of reconciliation and the realities of forgiveness and the realities of moving on and not harbouring things like anger and the want for retribution. You will see a very notable, if you do compare like for like testimonies from, the initial 10 years after the genocide to the sorts of themes that you see in testimonies that are much more recent. You will see a notable difference in tone between those. There's two excellent books. One of the authors is Anne-Marie de Brouwer, her name is. She works for an organisation that supports victims, supports survivors, particularly survivors of sexual violence from the genocide against the Tutsi. Her and some co-authors have authored two books. They actually authored a book about a decade ago now, which was called The Men Who Killed Me. So The Men Who Killed Me. And this was a book whereby it was visiting victim survivors from the genocide against the Tutsi who had suffered a degree of sexual violence. And it was interviewing and getting testimonies from those victims. And in those initial testimonies, you could really sense despair, a lack of hope, in some cases anger and resentment, not being able to see any future, these sorts of things. So the book was very interesting, but the book was also very downbeat. And, even the title itself, The Men Who Killed Me, because the implication is that although these survivors are still technically living, that they are, dead inside. They feel that their life is over because of what happened to them. So The Men Who Killed Me. And Anne-Marie and her team, I think to be fair, it was an excellent book, but I think to be fair, they recognised on reflecting a number of years later that maybe this wasn't the whole story and that it was maybe not giving any hope. And again, I'm putting words into their mouths here. You might have to ask them that, or maybe I'll actually ask Anne-Marie that. I'd quite like to ask her that myself. But I think that her and her team recognised that they didn't want that to be the end of their story. They didn't want that lack of hope, their death, to be the end of the story. And so 10 years after those initial testimonies were given, Anne-Marie and her team went back again to Rwanda and they re-interviewed the same victim survivors. So this wasn't a whole new group of people that they interviewed. They actually went back to the same people that gave their testimonies a decade beforehand and re-interviewed them now to see if any perceptions had changed, if their hopes had changed, if they now indeed had hope where previously they didn't have hope. Now, the horrible reality is that in the intervening 10 years, a couple of those survivors had in fact died. But a large number of them hadn't. A large number of those survivors are still going strong today. And what they found, and what you can detect when you read now these testimonies, these newer testimonies, which are the same survivors again, so the same survivors that a decade beforehand had been in lack of hope and despair. When you read the testimonies now of those same survivors, there's a very different tone. That a lot of those survivors, not all, but a large number of those survivors now have much more hope, and that when they're now reflecting on particularly those last decade, those last 10 or 12 years or so in Rwanda, they have been able to actually see a bit more hope. They've been able to actually see the improvements that have been made in society. They've been able to see that a lot of that reconciliation that they maybe previously had heard about but didn't feel, they can now sense that's more of a reality. And there's this very much different tone. And so the title of the follow-up book that was published is called And I Live On. So it gives so much more hope than what the first book did. So the first book, The Men Who Killed Me, and the second one, And I Live On. So basically this is now saying, even though they killed me, I now feel like I'm living again. I'm living on in this aftermath. And this is a very notable trend. You can see this across really a lot of the sources of victims' testimonies. But let's look explicitly at some of the things that actual victims have said. So again, I'm going to go through some of the testimonies that were from maybe between 10 and 15 years after the genocide, whereby you could sense a bit of mixed emotion coming in here. So we've got one testimony here from Athanasy Bugarimfora, who says, "Can there be any justice? For me, those that committed crimes should be punished in the way that they punished and killed other people. Because when you kill with a sword, you die by a sword too. Because I gain nothing if they're in prison. They're in prison, eating food, yet all my people have been killed. I've got no one to depend on, no one to share my problems with, but they are there. No one has been to apologise to me. But even if someone came and apologised and told me what had made him wrong me, I could forgive him. Even if I refused to forgive him, it wouldn't kill him, I think, to say sorry, I guess. I think unity and reconciliation would be possible if those who committed the crimes approached you and told you why they had committed them. Then you would have opened up a dialogue. But I haven't seen anything like this yet, although I hear the words unity and reconciliation on the radio." So I think in Athanasy's testimony here, you can sense quite a bit of conflict. So the testimony starts off by saying, those that killed should be killed. Those that caused violence should have violence perpetrated against them. Saying that, if they're sitting in prison eating food, and yet I'm a survivor that's sitting with nothing, then how is that justice? But then interestingly, the testimony moves on a little bit and begins talking about that, saying, if this perpetrator opened a dialogue and actually explained what happened, what turned them into a killer, what made them commit violence, was this something they wanted to do, or was this something they were forced to do? In other words, there appears to be somewhat of a lack of closure you can sense from this survivor here, from Athanasy here. You can sense there's a bit of a lack of closure, not understanding what happened and why it happened, and saying that if they could understand why, if there was a dialogue between perpetrators and victims, then maybe there was some way to move forward as a country. But Athanasy was saying that he hadn't kind of sensed that yet, or found that to be the case yet. We've got a similar theme that we can see from Emmanuel Gassana. So Emmanuel Gassana, who says, unity is a crucial feature of our society. Without unity, people would slaughter one another all over again. But reconciliation, first of all, it can't be an obligation. It must come from the heart. People have set up a kind of orientation to lead to reconciliation, but I don't think they're right. It's something without structure. It's natural. So what Emmanuel Gassana is saying here is that, again, he may not be feeling like he wants to forgive and reconcile with perpetrators yet. He might not have got to that point yet. But he does in reality understand, for a country to move forwards and not forever be left in this turmoil, that the reality is that unity needs to happen, reconciliation does need to happen. But importantly, what he's saying is that people can't be forced. You can't be forced either to apologise, and you can't be forced to accept an apology. You can't be forced to understand why somebody committed such serious acts of killing. That if somebody is going to do that, they need to go through a journey to actually reach that position themselves. And indeed, rather than people being forced to apologise and come together, there needs to be a genuine want, a genuine feeling from the bottom up. So in other words, what Gassana is saying, to be technical about it, is that he recognises that there have been certain top-down, so government-down initiatives to try and almost enforce reconciliation, enforce unity. But what Emmanuel Gassana is saying, that He accepts it's necessary, but it's only really going to work if it comes from the community up, from the bottom up. So rather than being enforced by the government or by the state, what Emmanuel Gassana was saying is the people themselves need to be involved in this process and at the heart of the process. So if there's going to be true reconciliation, true unity, that the people, the survivor communities, and the actual perpetrators themselves need to be the ones to actually work out how they do this. They need to be involved in that process. So even if they can't design it, but of course, because of course, resources for these initiatives, facilities to enable these things to happen, have to come from somewhere. So there does need to be state involvement. But maybe recognising what Gassana is saying, that there needs to be maybe more of an understanding that the people have to feed into these processes, help design these processes, if that unity and reconciliation is going to become an absolute reality. We've then got another testimony from Yves Cameronsi, who is saying, to me, it's as if nothing has been done as far as justice is concerned. When you see someone who killed your family being condemned for something like 5 years, you know that sooner or later that 5 years will be over and that he will then be released. Yes, being imprisoned is a punishment, but personally, justice hasn't come my way yet because I've never seen it. This is the first part of what Yves said here. Now, importantly, this testimony was about 10 years after the genocide, and so most trials hadn't actually yet happened or were in the process of happening, and most of those that had been convicted to offences were now in prison. And so what Yves was saying here at the point that he was giving his testimony was more like he didn't know or understand what was going to happen, that he didn't maybe know that the perpetrators weren't just going to appear back into their communities again. This was perhaps the fear that Yves had, that when that prison sentence was over and they would then just be released. Of course, what we discussed in part 1 is that in the majority of cases that's actually not how the transition or reintegration of perpetrators back into society has actually happened. So it might be interesting to go back and, re-interview someone like Yves again now, once these people have actually been coming back into communities through the method that we know has now happened, and see if Yves was still feeling the same way. So he was saying he hadn't seen justice at this point. If we were to fast forward to now, 26 years later, Yves will have seen the justice process play out in full. It doesn't necessarily mean that he would support it, but it may be interesting to go back and try and establish what Yves' perception is now, and if it is still the same as what it was in that roughly decade after the genocide. Yves does go on to say, we survivors need each other. Very few people who aren't survivors can actually help a survivor. A survivor is better able to encourage another survivor because he or she can relate to what they are going through. Sometimes hearing about the challenges faced by other people, other survivors, makes you feel that your own are less important. It instills some strength into you. So again, Yves Cameronsi here was saying that that survivors need each other. There needs to be survivors groups that people can actually work together within to understand and empathise and help each other, survivors communities. And to that end, indeed, there have been a large number of survivors communities that have been established, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. So this is maybe one of the other things that victims are saying they need. So they're saying that yes, they need and understand unity and reconciliation need to happen, as we've said. They do need to see and understand that justice is being done. They're saying that they need to be involved in the processes that are aiming to try and achieve that ultimate unity or reconciliation or forgiveness. And that importantly, that survivors groups need to exist. So almost like support groups for survivors themselves need to be established. So we're beginning to build up a picture here of the sorts of things that victims and survivors might need in the aftermath of this sort of mass victimisation that was perpetrated against them. We've then got another testimony here from Speciosi Mukamasoni, and Speciosi is saying, as for the future of Rwanda, all Rwandans should come together to try and build our nation, but this will only be achieved if they try and eliminate the habit of not punishing the guilty. The most important thing is to set up a culture of punishing those who harassed and killed others. They should be punished accordingly and in public for others to see and learn a lesson. If we stop the habit of not punishing, then we can build our countries. This is maybe the next thing that victim survivors are saying that they need. They do need, as well as the unity and reconciliation and recognising the community needs to come together, there's also a recognition that in the past, under the old genocidal regime, and throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and before that, of course, as well, but particularly through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, there was this culture of impunity. Those that committed violent acts against the Tutsi went unpunished by the MRND government, by Habyarimana's government. And what they don't want to see is for that culture of impunity, what you would call a culture of impunity, they don't want that culture of impunity to continue. That they do want those that committed violent acts to be punished. Now, what Speciosi here is not saying is that, that they want the perpetrators to be killed or to be executed. But it's saying there needs to be genuine punishment that those that were harmed can actually see being done. And this is then what may come or may have come through the likes of the Gacaca trial process, through the imprisonment, but importantly also when they're saying to see it being done, perhaps also through these TIG community service camps, whereby not only can they see that those that were perpetrating violence are subject to certain control, but also that they can see that those perpetrators are actually genuinely trying to do something to make good for the harm that they caused. So Speciosi again here said that they should be punished accordingly and in public for others to see and learn a lesson. So through the TIG activities in the aftermath of the prison sentence, these communities can see the perpetrators. They can see that they are actually subject to control. They can see them in communities doing the work that they are doing. So this is again another thing that we could at least argue as Rwanda has developed and continued to move forwards over these last 26 years, we can see that these different little things that are coming from these victims' testimonies are in fact being put into practice. Now, I've got a whole range of other testimonies which you can read on the PowerPoint. We're not going to talk over all of these just now because it's just simply sitting and repeating things. But you look at these yourself. Look at these testimonies and see if you can pull out certain themes that are ongoing and emerging. Now, importantly, most of these testimonies that we have here are from that first 10 to 15 year period after the genocide. And so what you might want to do is try and pick out the themes that you can see emerging here and try and map them on then to the actual measures that have been put in place in the aftermath of the genocide, and that what you should hopefully see is that a lot of those concerns that survivors were raising through their testimonies were being listened to by the Rwandan state, by the Rwandan government now, and were being embedded within the different and newer forms of what you would call transitional justice, the newer forms of activities and initiatives that are designed to try and create that unity and reconciliation in Rwanda. So again, I've got a whole number of these. The most important one that I would like to finish on, though, is in terms of the testimonies here, because I think this really sums up the problems, or the difficulties rather, in trying to put in place any one-fits-all solution to bringing and reuniting a country again in the aftermath of such an episode of mass victimisation. So we've got one final testimony statement here that comes from Manzi ulvira. So Manzi ulvira, who says, "I feel that unity and reconciliation are things that we ought to achieve, but sometimes I feel like forgiving, and sometimes not." So that's a real conundrum there, because what we have to realise is that somebody or individuals who have been through such trauma, such heartache, such loss, such harm, they're not going to always necessarily feel the same even from day to day. It may be that some days are better than others, as you will find for anybody who's suffered a high level of trauma or loss. And so, saying, but sometimes I feel like forgiving and sometimes not, we have to simply accept that there's not an easy solution to this. There's no one solution that can be put in place to help a country recover from mass victimization in this way, to help survivors of mass victimization to move forwards and have closure or forgiveness or unity or reconciliation. There's no one-fits-all approach that's going to automatically achieve that. And certainly, there's no short-term solution that is possible to achieve that. All of these solutions, if you would call it that, to mass victimization, and again, this is whether it is genocide, whether it is something like recovery from terrorism attacks, whether it is something like school shootings, whether it is the survivors or those that have been left behind, relatives of serial killing, whatever the form of mass victimization is, the solutions to those, to moving forwards after that mass victimization, A, are never easy, and B, are never short term. So whatever the form of mass victimization is, it always has to be, yes, there's things that you do in the short term, but a long-term view and a long-term set of solutions must be put in place to help the victims, and even in the broader sense, to help the communities in question. And that it's only through those long-term actions and initiatives that you will be able to achieve some stability in the aftermath of any event which involves mass victimization. So again, Manzi Ulvira was saying, sometimes I feel like forgiving and sometimes not. And that sort of feeling of, not being sure and, having some good days and some bad days, that will likely continue to be the case for some time. But you might find gradually the sort of thing that you will have heard in the past probably is that gradually, over time, then those individuals might start to have more good days than bad. They might begin to have more days where they feel like forgiving than not. And so we have to continually work. And this is why it's important again to realise that even with an issue like the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994, that this is still a current issue. Although the act itself, although the genocide itself was 26 years ago, it was in 1994, the act was then, the aftermath is now. The aftermath is still now. We're not in the immediate aftermath, but survivors are still there. Survivors still have needs. Again, someone that was a child that lost their parents, someone that was, let's say, 8 years old and lost their parents, they're still only in their 30s now. They're still only in their 30s now. They're still a young person. And so the issues that they will face, they may well still face for the rest of their life. They may still face those issues for 40, 50, 60 years. There are still issues of trauma. There are still issues of now perpetrators still being released from prison and now going back into their communities. So these issues are still very much current. They're very much current. And so it's important that these initiatives that are ongoing in countries like Rwanda and other countries where there have been mass victimization even a number of decades ago, it's important that these initiatives are not overlooked and halted. That these initiatives that are put in place to try and help aid reconciliation, including things like survivors groups, including help with trauma, all of these things still have to go on for a long period of time in the aftermath of any event of mass victimization. And so to that end, there are organisations that have been established in order to do this, to have oversight over this. So we have an organisation called Ebuka. So Ebuka, IBUKA. They are the umbrella organisation that were set up and are financed by the Rwandan government. So they're given a budget each year, and they're the umbrella organisation that oversees all of the other initiatives that exist. There's lots of little initiatives, whether it's top-down or bottom-up initiatives, that are designed to help survivors. So whether that is support groups, whether it's trauma and counselling, whether it's social activities, all sorts of different initiatives that still exist today to help survivors' communities. And the umbrella organisation that oversees all of that is called Ebuka. So they will provide annual reports to the government about When they then go in and evaluate all of these initiatives and look at what's happening, they will conduct qualitative research, for example, and they will look at the overall picture for the whole country on this journey of reconciliation, because it's very important. It's very difficult to set an ultimate target, because that would just set you up for failure. But there's lots of little milestones that you could look at and say, here's the successes that we've had in victims' communities and survivors' communities. Here's the success we've had. Here's where we believe that the situation has improved in this region or that village, and that they can sort of loosely measure the feeling, if you like, the feeling across the board of survivors' communities. So Ebuka are that organisation in Rwanda that's the umbrella organisation for all of the initiatives and other survivors' organisations that exist. We have the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, it's the NURC. So as well as, bearing in mind that Ebuka deals specifically with victims and survivors organisations, the NURC, the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission that exist, are there to oversee all of the activities that try and bring about unity and reconciliation between perpetrators and victim survivors. And so they don't have a sole focus on victim survivors like Ebuka does. Rather, they will try and do and become involved in and oversee any activities that are intending specifically to try and help aid unity and reconciliation amongst the Rwandan people. And so again, there's a large number of initiatives that are intended to do this. I've got a picture here of Bishop John Rukyahana, who for a number of years was the chair or the head of the NURC, and this picture here is actually, it's with one of my friends, Evelyn, from Rwanda, and this was actually in John Rukyahana's back garden. We were actually in his back garden here. So here was he's the chairperson who ultimately was in charge. He's recently retired, but he was in charge of the NURC for a number of years. But the NURC would oversee a number of organisations and initiatives that are trying to help aid unity and reconciliation in Rwanda. A couple of examples of that: we have a number of cooperatives that have been set up and established. So cooperatives are organisations that are designed to allow both survivors and perpetrators to come together and do something together that would achieve some common good in community. So these cooperatives could be things like designing arts and crafts. So it could be things like basket weaving, actually designing and making baskets together to sell at local markets. It could be designing traditional African or Rwandan tiles that can be sold and used for decoration in homes and businesses. So it could be things like that. And again, one of the images that we've got here shows you some examples from one of the cooperatives that I've visited in Rwanda. And the aim is supposed to be here that survivor communities and perpetrators can come together and do something good together, and they can see the output of their combined work together. There's also other ones that do things like clothing and tailored clothing that they will build together. In actual fact, given that all of you are university students, I've visited a cooperative whereby they actually do make academic gowns. They actually make gowns that people who are graduating university would be able to wear. So these cooperatives will be given finance by the government, so that they'll be financed by the government as long as, and the only stipulation for them receiving funding is that they are open to all. So these cooperatives cannot be closed off to certain groups or people. These cooperatives are open to all to go in and work within if they choose to. And if they do that, if they're open and if they encourage groups to come together and work together, then they can receive certain levels of funding from the government. Now, we've just mentioned then coming together and working together. Another way this happens in Rwanda is that the idea was brought about that, again, historically, there was an initiative like this, which had fallen by the wayside a number of years beforehand. But there was an idea to try and bring back a former traditional community service work day called Umuganda. So Umuganda now falls on the last Saturday of each month. So the last Saturday of each month, it's expected that everybody in Rwanda, for that morning, it's not for the whole day, but for that morning, to come out, let's say, from 8 in the morning until midday or 1 o'clock, and they'll engage in some community work together. So again, I've taken part in Umuganda before, and I've got some photographs here, which I'll mention in a moment to you. So the idea would be that there are notice boards that in the week leading up to Umuganda will have notices placed on them which say, on this Umuganda, on this Saturday, here's lots of things that we could do as a community together. So some of that might involve just simply cleaning up round about the community. Others might involve going and, let's say, excavating the side of a hill, flattening it out to make it appropriate for houses for survivors to be built. So something like that. And the idea would be that everyone then can come out and they can see what they can choose to do in any given community, and then they go there and get involved and get stuck in. Now, let's say from these photos that you can see here, this indeed was one example that we were talking about. It was excavating the side of a hill to make it flat and to make it useful to build some houses for poorer communities on. And if you were to send, let's say, a company there to do that, and they brought with them 10 or 15 people to get involved, first of all, those 10 or 15 people cannot work intensively during a shift at work because they'd be exhausted. So those 10 or 15 people would have to do, some periods of intense work, some periods of break time, and it might take weeks in order to excavate that hill. Whereas here, what you would find would happen is that on that Saturday at 8 a.m, you will find that 3,000 people, let's say, will descend on that area, and each bringing their own tools if they have them. If they don't have them, it doesn't matter. They still can just go along. And you will have, in that area, you will maybe only actually at any one time have 15 people. So that same amount of people that might happen if this was a private company. But they will work intensively for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And then that person will then receive a tap on the shoulder from someone else, who will then take those tools from you, and they will continue to work intensively for another 10 minutes before someone taps them on the shoulder, takes the tools, and they then have their turn. So what you find is that during that morning that you're there, you might be in that area for 3 or 4 hours, and you might take 3 or 4 turns during that time. So you might take 3 turns where you work intensively for 10 minutes and then pass your tools on to someone else. So you're then questioning, well, if you've only got, let's say, 15 or 20 people that are working, what's everyone else doing? Well, what everyone else is supposed to be doing. So you've almost got the inner circle and the outer circle. The inner circle are the ones that are carrying out that intense work. The outer circle are supposed to be talking, supposed to be engaging in dialogue. So over the last month, between last Umuganda and this Umuganda, have you faced any challenges in the community? Is there anything that as a community we can do better? Have you got anything that you don't think is working? Have you got any ideas about how we can move forward and continue to progress as a community? So you're supposed to be talking about these issues with your neighbours, with the other people from your community. Likewise, if there have been disputes, so if there has been a disagreement between neighbours, the aim is supposed to be that you clear the air at that next Umuganda. You talk, you have a dialogue, you get issues out in the open, you get a solution dealt with, and then you move on. So there's no simmering tensions there's supposed to be. The idea is supposed to be at Umuganda that if you need someone to sort of mediate that dispute, there's someone there that can do that from your community to then allow you to move forward together as that community. So you've got it's almost like a community meeting, if you like. It's like a monthly community meeting. So all of this is being discussed in so the majority of the time that you're at Umuganda, the majority of the time you're actually not doing this heavy work. The majority of the time you're talking. You're talking with people, you're getting to know people, you're understanding people, you're understanding that community and being part of that community. But ultimately, because throughout that 4 hours, it's intense work that's going on that entire time, by the time that you get to that end of that 4 hours, you would be probably shocked at just how much it's been possible to achieve in that time. And so again, what then happens is you get to the end of that 4 hours of work, and everyone's talked, everyone understands, and you've got someone in responsibility that's sort of taking notes about the different things that people have talked about, the different disputes that have happened, the different ways people have suggested the community can grow together and work together and improve together. So you've got people that are actually taking notes on all of these things and bringing them together. So at the end of that 4 hours, everybody, first of all, can physically see the product of their unity, the product of them working together and what they've been able to physically achieve. Visually, they can see it. So in our case, this was an entire area that had previously just been wasteland and overgrown, which was then completely cleared and flattened just in those 4 hours. You could see, it was incredible to see just how much had been achieved in that time. For others, it might be that they can actually see that they've been able to build 2, rudimentary, but 2 small houses together. It could be something like that. In some cases, it could be they've actually helped to build a new access road for a poor community that didn't previously exist. Anything like that it could be. And you can see that. Now, the pictures that I've got here, this was a young girl that she was coming to Umaganda for the first time with her father. And she was desperate to get involved and wanted to be shown how to actually dig and use tools and that sort of thing. And so, we helped her. We helped her to show her how to do this work. And she was absolutely delighted to be there and to feel like she was part of something and part of this community. Now, at the end of that 4-hour period, then, what happens is there's usually a bit of a party atmosphere that you can see happening. At the end of the particular Umaganda period that the Umaganda that I was taking part in there, we were unbelievably fortunate that the president himself was actually going to make a speech. The president, Paul Kagame, does make a speech every Umaganda period, but he goes to different parts of the country to do this. And we were incredibly fortunate that it was only about maybe a 10-minute walk from where we were doing Umaganda that the president was going to go to speak. And so in this case, the people from the Umaganda the area that we were at, went along to this. It was actually a football pitch, and the president had been given notes about what had been achieved in that community, and he then spoke about the strength of the Rwandan people coming together and what they can do when they work as one nation and all of these sorts of things. There's a broader story that I could tell here about how I did feel a little bit uncomfortable at being, and I do, horrible as it is, believe it's because I'm white, because I can't think of any other reason, that when we went there, we were sort of taken out of the crowd and allowed to go, behind the scenes, so to speak, to a bit of a VIP area. But in any case, we had basically a prime view of all of this unfolding. But as well as this, normally at the end of the Umaganda day, what will happen is the community will then do something like this itself. So the local community leaders will have a stage set up. They will then talk through, what the community have achieved in that area, what the results of the hard work have been, any suggestions that have been made in order to move forwards. And there's usually, food and drink and song and dance that lunchtime. So that lunchtime then at the end of the Umaganda period, again, everyone's sort of coming together for almost it's almost like a community party, I suppose. So that's the Umaganda. Umaganda that is the last Saturday of each month. Now, it's important as well for you to understand that some people might have different perspectives on this, but this Umaganda is supposed to be everybody that's a Rwandan national in the country that does this. Tourists and non-nationals are not, you're not forced to do this. You're not forced to. And in actual fact, the perception that you might see from some negative writing on the subject is that if people are forced to do this, then it's wrong. They shouldn't be forced to come out and become involved in these things. The reality is that, again, I've been in the country and seen this. It's not forced in that way. What would happen is if you were out on the streets in general, so if you were out in the streets on the morning of Umaganda and you weren't involved in Umaganda, then, the police might say to you, well, what are you doing? Are you not doing the Umaganda work today? They might ask you what you're doing or where you're going. But that's really all there is about it. And ultimately, if you choose, even as a Rwandan national, not to bother, like if you choose just to stay in your house or to lie down in bed and sleep in, nothing happens. You don't get a chap at the door from the police saying, you're going to jail because you've not done Umaganda. No, that doesn't happen. It's more of it's not looked on favourably if you're a Rwandan national in the country and you don't get involved. It's not looked on favourably. You might be sort of viewed with suspicion, or you might get a few tuts from, you know, your neighbours or something if you don't become involved in that. So it's almost like a sort of a community themselves signalling disapproval if people don't become involved, because they would question why you don't want to become part of that community and do the work together. So yeah, it's technically supposed to be mandatory that everyone does this, but in reality, you know, I've got friends that, you know, they do it most of the time, but sometimes they wake up that Saturday morning and they just think, well, I really can't be bothered today, and so they'll just lie in bed. And nothing's done if they do that. You know, you don't get hauled off to jail or anything like that. But of course, I've wanted to become involved, to actually experience that for myself, and so I have been involved in Umuganda a couple of times, and what you will see is that everybody does get involved. Genuinely, everybody gets involved and mucked in. So when it comes to the excavating the side of that hill, you will have had police officers in their uniform actually, you know, getting involved and doing the digging, doing the clearing. You will have people from the army that are actually, again, in uniform, but they will still, if there's a chain, if you need to, like, let's say, get all the rubbish from an area moved from wherever it is to a skip, they will be part of the line that's passing all of that along to that skip. So it's everybody, whether they're even those that are actively on duty, that become involved in these activities. So again, the aim is here that this is one of these initiatives that is trying to foster unity, reconciliation, to allow dialogue to continue to take place in communities, to allow any disputes or issues to be aired in the open and dealt with there and then, so that moving forward there's not tensions that are building up and falling out. So the idea here again is to bring both survivors and perpetrators together and to work together for the benefit of the nation. And for their own benefit too, So how do I sum all of this up? Because this is incredibly difficult, I think. How do we sum all of this up? Well, if we're summing up the entirety of what we've talked about over the last 2 weeks, we've used the example of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda to talk about mass victimisation. Because for me, that's an obvious example. You're talking about a huge number of people that have had violence perpetrated against them. You've got victims who have died, and you've got victims who are now survivors that have lived. And they do have a range of needs and rights. Needs and then rights that come once those needs have been evaluated, I suppose. So you've got a whole range of needs. When we've talked about some of the victims' testimonies, about the sorts of things that they need in order to be able to move forwards with their lives. And when we talk about rights here, what we can then see is that in Rwanda's case, they have genuinely listened to what victims, what survivors have said they need, and they have tried their best then to implement that within certain initiatives, within certain policies, that will then give those victims the rights to be involved in those processes, the rights to have access to those services that might help then to meet those needs. But when it comes to mass victimisation, the victim or the survivor's needs are complex, that they have several different needs that we've talked about. They've got several different issues. There are lots and lots of consequences of mass victimisation, which may in some cases be very different to, you know, a single act of victimisation, such as we've talked about in past weeks. And that the recovery from mass victimisation, again, whether we're talking about Rwanda or whether we're talking about the various other forms of mass victimisation that we've briefly mentioned, the recovery from that mass victimisation is, if not always, certainly most of the time, a long-term recovery process that requires a number of different potential initiatives and actions and interventions in order to ensure that victims' communities, survivors' communities, can actually continue to move forwards with their lives. So that's mass victimisation. We've given the example of Rwanda. Hopefully you've found that interesting. That'll finish us up for this week. If anyone has any questions about all of this, then of course I'm very much open to discussing, because all of the things that I know, let's say, not only about Rwanda, but about mass victimisation in general, goes way beyond what we've been able to talk about in the limited time that we have. And so, you know, if anyone is interested in mass victimisation in general, in other years, for example, I have talked about school shootings, I have talked about serial killers. different things like that. So, you know, if you've got any questions about those sorts of topics or other areas of mass victimisation, I'm more than open to you getting in touch to do that. But for now, that is all the time that we've got. So hopefully you found that interesting. We've not got very much more to go in this term in terms of lecture content. We really just have one more main lecture to go, which will be next week. And so, yep, we shall see you then. Thanks again for watching.